go.
All right, moving into new material on the second outline that I've given to you. As you know, it's commonly thought that the Bible is divided into two books, the Old Testament and the New Testament. I've put those terms in quotes for a reason. But the Old Testament is revelation about Christ who is to come, and the New Testament is revelation about Christ who has come. But this distinction between an Old Testament and a New Testament is not a distinction made in the Scriptures themselves. There is a distinction made in the Scriptures between an Old Covenant, sometimes called the First Covenant in the letter to the Hebrews, and the New Covenant, also referred to in the letter to the Hebrews as the Second Covenant. But that's not the same thing as Old Testament and New Testament. It's often thought that, okay, Old Covenant, Old Testament's the book of the Old Covenant, makes sense. New Testament, that's the book of the New Covenant. However, Jesus lived under and fulfilled the New Covenant, and his coming and life and ministry and death and resurrection and ascension is presented to us in the New Testament books, right? So there's an overlap, and the Gospels are like the center point of the Bible, because in the Gospels you find the fulfillment of all the Hebrew Scriptures, and you find the foundation for all that the apostles wrote in their letters and in the Revelation and what's recorded in the book of Acts. So the Gospels are, as it were, the center point. What takes place in the very end of the Old Covenant and in the inaugurating of the New Covenant. Okay. So what we find is that instead of Old Testament and New Testament, we have one seamless garment, as it were, one continuous unfolding story. And that's why I suggest to you it's easiest to think about what we call Old Testament as the Scriptures pointing to and leading up to Christ, and the New Testament as the Scriptures presenting and following on the coming of Christ. Okay? But to think of it as one book. Now, on your outline, you see I did have a little discussion of the successive testaments of Scripture. If you want to think of the Bible as testaments, then there are actually 4 of them, and in this I'm building on the work of James Jordan. Okay, so I can refer you for one more detailed accounting. But as I gave you the chart that depicts the unfolding history of Israel, the giving of the Bible itself tracks that history. We receive more written and scripturated revelation, the inspired, infallible, authoritative revelation of God written. We receive that as the history of the Bible, as the history of redemption unfolds, as God's covenant plan unfolds. And so what is the first testament or body of scriptural revelation? Well, it's that's given during the first phase of the history of the history of salvation, what we call the 5 books of Moses, during the Sinaitic era. Moses died. Moses lived and ministered, served, died right around 1500 BC, according to the round numbers of the chart that I gave to you. Well, that's when the people of God received the Pentateuch, by the end of the life of Moses. And then a generation later, the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua was Moses' successor and led the people into Israel. Well, then after another several hundred years, that covenant phase of the unfolding plan of God began to, and the arrangements, the structures of that we'll look at as we get into the actual text, began to break down. And so God establishes a new edition, as it were, of the unfolding covenant, new arrangements, a new era, the kingdom era, and you receive a new body of revelation, new body of scriptural revelation. So in that period of time, we receive the books of Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, or simply the book of Samuel, the book of Job, the Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, okay, during that phase of history. Then, after another couple of hundred years, God begins a new phase in the history of salvation. The people go into exile for 70 years, and then they're restored. And God sends the writing prophets. And so we have a new body of scriptural revelation, a third testament, as it were. And that would include Isaiah, Kings, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Esther, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the 12 so-called minor prophets. Well, then, after about 400 years, God sends Jesus the Messiah and establishes the final new covenant. And by now you've got the pattern down. There's a new body of scriptural revelation, what we call the New Testament, the Gospels, the book of Acts, the epistles, and the Revelation. So you can see there's four main phases and four main, as it were, bodies of revelation that is given in written form. And those are four more reasons why it's just in many ways unhelpful, although it's in our minds, it's imbued in us, it's in our bones, that there's Old Testament, New Testament. You really want to think of it as one book, one body of revelation, and true to the actual giving of the revelation, it comes during four periods, okay, four main periods. So what we see, and what I'm trying to emphasize, is really the unity of Scripture as presenting the unity of the one unfolding plan of salvation. If you look in Hebrews 13:20, you see that the writer refers to the blood of the eternal covenant, singular. The blood of the eternal covenant, singular. But then in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12, Paul refers to the covenants, plural, of promise, singular. What does this tell us? It tells us that there's one eternal covenant that unfolds in a succession of historical covenants. The covenant is one, and yet the covenant is many. And so that's the story that unfolds in Scripture. And that's why Scripture is an integral part itself of God's unfolding plan of redemption. Scripture is an integral part of our salvation. All right. Well, I want to call your attention quickly to another diagram that I've given to you. And at the top on the page it says Learning the Books of the Bible. You have the Old Testament books. Again, you can't escape this language. I hope what I've just said helps you to think of what we mean by Old Testament in a slightly different way. But you have the Old Testament books, that is the books that look forward to the coming of Jesus, as listed and grouped by the Hebrews. This would be what we call the Hebrew canon of Scripture. And you see, starting at the left, you have the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And I've penned in there that this is, the law is the covenant, and it's the foundation. This is the foundational period of the plan of redemption. It's the foundational covenant, okay? It's at the beginning, and everything is built on that. Everything follows from that. Then the next grouping is the prophets. The prophets. And you have at the beginning what the Hebrews refer to as the former prophets. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. We think of these, and you can see the English Bible, the grouping of the Bible books in the English Bible just below that. We call this the historical books. Okay? Well, they refer to it as the prophets. These are the former prophets. And then you have the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. And part of the latter prophets is the 12, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So now you have two major groupings in the Bible, in the Hebrew canon, the law and the prophets, and then thirdly, the writings. What's included in the writings? Well, what we call the wisdom literature, the Psalms and the Proverbs, Job, But also in Song of Solomon, we consider that as the wisdom literature. But then there's these other books as part of the writings. Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, we would consider Ecclesiastes part of the wisdom literature. Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. So in my Hebrew Bible, Hebrew Old Testament, the last books in the Bible, the last book in the Bible is not Malachi as in our English Bibles. It's Second Chronicles. And on the front cover of the Hebrew Bible, it says Torah, Naba'im, Kethuvim, Law, Prophets, Writings. And that's the way the Hebrews arranged the writings of the Bible. Well, this is very informative to us because what we call the historical books, oftentimes they seem odd to us because of when we think of history, we think of, for example, a history of the war between the states. Names, places, dates, data, careful rehearsing of the unfolding of the events and so on. Whereas when you read what we call the historical books, Joshua, wouldn't you love to have a first-hand account of the conquest in the style and form of modern historical writing? Because as you read Joshua, there's all these questions that come to mind because we're used to reading modern style history. Well, what is Joshua about? It's the former prophets according to the Hebrew canon. It is prophetic history. In other words, it's not history simply to inform us, but it does do that. It does inform us. But it shows us the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel given in the foundational phase of Revelation, the law. And it tells us, that Joshua gives this ringing call to faithfulness. He says, choose you this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And he tells them that not one promise that God has made has failed of fulfillment. Think of Deuteronomy chapter 28, where God makes these wonderful promises. If they trust him, they walk in his ways. And it sort of sets you up for the following book, such as the unfolding story in Judges. What happens? The people are not faithful. And so then the judgments that Deuteronomy warned about in the latter part of Deuteronomy 28 begin to come into play. The people cry out for a deliverer. God delivers them. And as you know, Judges goes through a number of cycles. Well, you see the way the Hebrew Bible is arranged. I'm not going to detail the unfolding tracking of Revelation with the unfolding story here because we'll be doing that as we go on. You can see how it tracks the history, okay? And you can see our grouping below that, how it's a little bit of a different arrangement and in some ways obscures that. You can buy Bibles that are arranged chronologically, such as the Reese Chronological Bible, that help sort of recapture some of this. All right. Well then, note the third chart at the bottom, the New Testament books. And there are three major groupings of the books, aren't there? The Gospels, then the Acts, and what do you have in the Gospels and Acts? Where you have the foundational historical record of the beginning of the New Covenant and the life and ministry of Jesus, culminating in his death and resurrection and ascension, the outpouring of the Spirit on the day of Pentecost as it's recorded in Acts, and the Spirit-empowered apostles going into all the world. Then you have Paul's epistles. Paul is, as it were, like a new covenant version of the prophets, calling us to remember all the fulfillment of the whole Hebrew canon by and in and through Jesus Christ. All the fullness that has been given to us, calling us to be faithful to that. And then you have the general epistles that do much the same thing. And finally, the Apocalypse. if you flip your chart over, you'll see that there's some similarity. At the bottom, you have the chart by Cornelius van der Wal from his Search the Scriptures, Volume 1. There are 10 short paperback books. He wrote these basically for high school students. And if you can get a hold of them, they're well worth having. I think you can get them for free as PDF files off the internet these days. But you see on the left-hand part, Matthew through John at the bottom. He sees that as corresponding to Genesis through Deuteronomy, the early history, the covenant of Mount Sinai promised to man through the covenant. You have paralleled by the Gospels. Also, the book of Acts, he sees that as corresponding to Joshua through Esther, a God upholding the covenant and redemptive history, and then the letters in Revelation corresponding to the prophets and the Psalms and the wisdom books, preaching about the promised demand and curse of the covenant. Again, these are very broad, sweeping generalizations, but you can see the relation there. God's written revelation follows a pattern. Another chart above that, again from Cornelius van der Wal's book, Search the Scriptures, Volume 1. You can see how the Pentateuch in the early church, Pentateuch in the early history, the covenant of Mount Sinai, the law of the covenant is foundational, then built on that. It's a vertical chart. Built on that is the former prophets, speaking of how the Lord upholds his covenant, then the third part of the canon, the poetical books, wisdom and songs of the covenant. And this is why the writings of the warnings and promises rooted in the covenant are included. Writings such as Ruth and Lamentations and Esther and Daniel, Ezra and Nehemiah and Chronicles are included in that latter part of the Hebrew canon. And then I should put Christ and the Gospels up above that, just to bring into play the New Covenant, the New Testament Scriptures. Anyway, those charts can be useful to you in thinking about how the Bible is laid out. That's my only intention there. All right? Well then, in our remaining time, I'm going to call your attention to some considerations in understanding the stories of the unfolding story of Jesus. We call this the history of redemption. You can just as well call it the history of the covenant or the history of Jesus. And these are from S.G. de Graaf's book, his 4-volume book, Promise and Deliverance. And I'll be giving you a handout, a photocopy of the introduction to that as a class handout. But these are some observations from his introduction in Volume 1. First of all, concerning the aim and content of biblical history, de Graaf says we are to view the entire Holy Scripture as nothing more or less than the self-revelation of God, and which brings salvation to those who believe in Him. And then secondly, Scripture is prophecy. That is true even of the historical passages. In other words, every story in Scripture reveals something of the counsel of God for our redemption, even though every story tells it differently. And in every story, God is the prime agent, revealing himself through his acts as the Redeemer. And then thirdly, God reveals himself in the mediator. De Graaf says the mediator was operative throughout the Old Testament era. It's not just New Testament. His work did not begin at the start of the New Testament. He already penetrated Old Testament history, moving among the people in shadows in order to reveal himself. Everything in the Old Testament is full of him, and history has become one great miracle through his Spirit. And I've given you cross-references to Jesus' own statements in the 24 that we looked at last week. And then fourth and last, God reveals himself in his covenant with his people. De Graaf says, in the covenant, God always draws near to his people as a whole, never just to individuals. Because of the covenant, the entire people rests secure in God's faithfulness. And every individual member of the covenant shares in that rest as a member of the covenant, as a member of the community. And added in brackets, through faith in God's promise. So, this is to say we read the Old Testament as the unfolding story of Jesus under types and shadows. I'm going to give you an example of this. I listed one there. So look with me at 1 Samuel 17. This is the familiar story of David and Goliath. Now, when you read this story, you see David's faith, his zeal for the Lord, you see his courage. He goes up against a trained warrior who's a giant to boot, and he's just a young man, probably no more than in his later teens. And so you can draw from that, what an example of courage, what an example of faith, what an example of zeal for the Lord. And all that's true. But keeping in mind the things that de Graaf has pointed out in the quotes that I gave you, the story reveals Christ. Now, in 1 Samuel 16, David is anointed by the prophet Samuel to be Saul's successor. So who is the Messiah at this phase of history? Well, Saul is still the king. He was anointed by Samuel, but Saul has departed from the Lord. And so that's the very reason why David is anointed as Saul's successor. But he's not been made king yet. He's going to go through a period of testing and of growth and maturing. Remember those themes from Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Spiritual warfare before he is actually crowned. But he is presently God's anointed, and he's about to be unveiled as a type of Christ, who is the final anointed one of God. Now, when he goes to face Goliath, you know the story, so I'm just going to call your attention to verse 41. The Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." So this great warrior, who's a giant, is a mighty man, comes to David and curses him in the name of his gods. Then David, verse 45, said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day Yahweh will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that Yahweh saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is Yahweh's, and he will give you into our hand." And then, of course, he kills Goliath with a stone, and the armies of the Philistines are routed and defeated. What is going on here? Well, you have the champion of the Philistines and their gods, and you have the champion of Yahweh, God, the living and true God. Now, from what you can see with your eyes, it's a rather uneven match. If people were taking bets, probably most of them would have been betting on Goliath. But by faith in Yahweh and in the fact that he is anointed David is the Mashiach, the Messiah, the anointed one, God's representative, you would think differently. God is going to do something mighty to display his grace and mercy and his redemptive power to his people, the Israelites. And so David is a type and a foreshadowing of Christ. And notice that the redemption he brings is not pertaining just to his own personal, private, individual life. It certainly includes that. but it's for Israel. He does this as the anointed of God on behalf of Israel. So you can see how this story preaches Christ. Not much more can be said, but enough just to illustrate briefly the principle here. In the same way, all Scripture preaches Christ, and so that's why I gave you those quotes from S.G. de Graaf to kind of help you be heightened in your awareness as you read the unfolding story and look for Christ in it. Well, we will stop at that point and take questions and have discussion.